Hello, everyone, and welcome to this HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership virtual program. My name is Stephen Boyd, and I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management and Student Life at HJ International. We're really delighted this evening that each of you can join us for today's presentation. This is the third year in a row that we have gathered to offer a special tribute, a special program to commemorate the entry of Reverend Myung Moon, our true father, into Danbury Federal Prison. We have individuals joining us really from all over the United States this evening, as well as all parts of the globe. So we want to thank you for coming to this important gathering, and we look forward to sharing this important program with you. Now, before we begin our program, just a couple of housekeeping items. This event today, because of the large attendance, we've had several hundred registrations for this program, is being transmitted in webinar mode through Zoom. At any time during the event, you're welcome to type your questions into the Q&A box during the presentation and the conversation. Towards the end of the program, we will have a Q&A session, and at that time, we'll be happy to field the questions that you have submitted to the best of our ability. We know there are going to be many questions. There are many on the call today, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. This is also an opportunity for each of you to learn more about HJI International as an institution. And to that end, I will provide my contact information as well as important links about HJI and our degree programs for your consideration. To begin our program today, I would like to introduce our host, Dr. Thomas Walsh, President of HJI International, who will offer welcome remarks and introduce our main presenter this evening. Dr. Thomas G. Walsh is the 7th president of HJI International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership, formerly known, as many of you know, as Unification Theological Seminary. As a 1979 graduate of our institution, Dr. Walsh went on to earn his PhD at Vanderbilt University's School of Religion, where he specialized in the study of religion and ethics. Since his graduation, Dr. Walsh has taught courses at several colleges and universities, as well as here at HJI. As he became more involved with the academic and ecumenical activities of the unification movement in the 1990s particularly, he continued to teach on a part-time basis in higher education for several years. Dr. Walsh has worked closely with the HJI co-founders, Reverend Myung Moon and Dr. HJI Moon, in the establishment and in the leadership of the Universal Peace Federation, UPF, where, as many of you know, until very recently, he served as the international chair. Dr. Walsh has edited more than 20 books and publications and serves as the executive editor of Dialogue and Alliance, an academic journal indexed by the American Theological Library Association. So it's my honor and pleasure to present to you Dr. Thomas Walsh. Dr. Walsh?
Thank you for that kind introduction, Dean Stephen Boyd, and for your great work for HJI. You know, many of us are getting used to or more comfortable with the term HJI, which is the shortened form of the HJI International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership, formerly, as Dean Boyd said, Unification Theological Seminary, where we go forward with our same mission and focus on excellence in public ministry and public leadership, rooted in the core values and principles of our founders. As we consider this topic that Dean Boyd described, this is the third in a series where we reflect on the tragic occasion where our founder was incarcerated in 1984 in Danbury. I recall a year ago, approximately at this time, in our second in this series, we featured Dr. Peter Kim, a chief of staff of Reverend Moon, close to the entire Moon family, and he shared many stories and anecdotes of that time and the suffering, and reflecting back on the impact that it had on our movement. in a very, very destructive way. So I think this discussion this evening is very important, this topic, the fraudulent myth of the cult expert, factors contributing to the wrongful indictment and imprisonment of Myung Moon is very important. And I would add that the importance of, speaking as the president of HJI, the importance of scholarship and the potential of scholars to represent a neutral, objective, unbiased approach to the study, particularly of religious phenomenon. And there were so many that stepped up at that time, as well as many Christian, Jewish, and pastors and religious leaders from all faiths who saw this as indeed a wrongful indictment and imprisonment. We're lucky and fortunate to have with us this evening my immediate predecessor as the president of UTS, now HJI, Dr. Thomas Ward. He currently serves as our provost and the chair of the Master of Arts program in Peace Studies and professor of Peace and Development at HJ International. His work on peace and development studies has been published in several major journals and by Paragon House and by the London publishing firm International Relations. Dr. Ward has been a professional educator for more than 4 decades. He has been a Fulbright Scholar in France, a Foreign Ministry Research Fellow in Taiwan, and a guest lecturer at the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing and at the National Academy of Political and Strategic Studies in Santiago, Chile. In addition to his career as an academician, a scholar, he is a longtime member of the Unification Church, now known as the Family Federation. Indeed, one reason that he is particularly suited for tonight's conversation, that on 2 occasions he went through a process of what's called deprogramming. We'll hear more about that in a moment. And indeed, litigated the deprogramming, the unjust deprogramming, which is a kind of kidnapping process of a believer. And this was taken as far as the Supreme Court for consideration in 1982. And his efforts resulted in expanded protections and recourse for deprogramming victims. So we're very fortunate that we have Dr. Thomas Ward with us this evening. And he will now take the floor. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So as Dean Boyd said, please enter your questions in the Q&A, the icon at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Thomas Ward. Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, for your kind invitation. And thank you to everyone who has joined us tonight on this solemn occasion. Indeed, as you've heard already from Dean Boyd, this marks the 39th anniversary of Reverend Myung Moon's entry into Danbury Prison. I'm sitting before you tonight in this jacket, and this jacket was given to me by Dr. Moon and Dr. Hakchahan Moon about a week before Dr. Moon went into prison. And I happen to have been quite a bit around East Garden during those days before his imprisonment. I also had the chance to visit with Reverend Moon and in Danbury Prison on one occasion. What I remember is that he always kept a positive attitude and a positive mindset. And he did not allow himself to be consumed by anger or disappointment or accusation. Instead, he just focused upon his desire to love America, to be a model even in that adverse situation of the prison. I wish that I could say the same about myself. I can't. Oftentimes when I saw things such as this, I became disappointed. I became frustrated because over and over again, like so many of you have also seen, our movement was improperly represented. And what I'd like to do this evening is I'd like to share a little bit about the conditions that I believe played a major role in what culminated in the court case against Reverend Myung Moon. I have a lot of material to share, but we have a limited amount of time. So therefore, I'm not going to be able to share everything that I'd like to be able to share tonight. I'm reminded, Dr. Walsh, when I hear that, I think about Dr. David Kim, who so often would talk about Jesus' famous words, "I have many things to say to you, but you cannot receive them now." And what Dr. Kim would say was, "I have many things to say to you, but there's no time." So unfortunately, that may be the case tonight. I can't cover everything, but I will cover as much as I can. Please forgive me if I have to skip over some things, but I hope that what I share will help all of us to understand some of the things that led to the challenges that led to finally the court case. And also, I hope that what I share tonight will be helpful in understanding why all of that was very unfair. So I'm going to try to share my screen next. Okay, thank you.
Looks good.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your patience. So anyways, let me just begin by saying that Dr. HJI Moon has often talked about the importance and the need for the creation of what she refers to as an environment for witnessing. At the same time, I think that it can be said that those who opposed us, what they worked to do was to foster an environment of animosity and hysteria towards our church, which was indeed most unfortunate. When society changes, there are certain entities within society that play a key role. At the foundation of most changes are interest groups. For example, the Civil Rights Movement was an interest group. And likewise, Universal Peace Federation is an interest group, or the American Clergy Leadership Conference is an interest group. Likewise, the anti-cult movement was an interest group. And they have, in each case, they have a certain issue that they want to bring forward to the public, or maybe a number of issues that they want to bring forward to the public. And the interest groups that make the greatest difference are those who eventually succeed in being able to capture the attention of the media. And if they can capture the attention of the media, then from there, they can also have an impact in so many other ways. The press played a major role in terms of fostering an environment that was adverse towards the work of Reverend Moon and Dr. HJI Moon. And certainly one of the principal publications that played a role in that was the Washington Post. And there were reasons for that, but there's not really time to go into that. As I said, the media, when the story becomes a pertinent story, it affects political parties. It eventually can lead to legislation. It can lead to executive decisions. It can even lead to decisions by courts concerning the way in which different organizations are perceived, and judges act based upon those perceptions on many occasions. So all of you have certainly seen the Truth is My Sword film. I think I've seen it more than any of you, but all of you have seen the Truth is My Sword film. And in that film, we learn about Donald Fraser's investigation of our church. And he issued at the end of that, the Fraser report. And in that report, he pointed out that he felt that there were a number of irregularities involving our movement, but he also pointed out that in that period of time, suddenly there had been unleashed a number of investigations, one of which was by the Internal Revenue Service. And likewise, just a few weeks after that, the Senate Minority Leader at that time, Robert Dole, also emphasized, having read the Moon report, that he felt that it was very important to review the tax-exempt status of certain cults that describe themselves as religions. On the 5th of February, 1979, he had an investigation open in the Senate, and he invited in 13 cult experts. This is one of the documents that was used to inform people of this. It was also, I guess, used as a news release. And in total, there were a group of some 13 experts on cults. And I just want to quickly review that group with you and talk a little bit about them. And I'll cover as many as I can. I may not be able to cover some of them, so if I do skip at some point, please forgive me. These experts included, first of all, Mr. Ted Patrick. Ted Patrick became the first deprogrammer. He's called the father of deprogramming. He was not a theologian. He was not a religious scholar. He was not a psychologist. He was not a psychiatrist. He was actually a man with a 10th grade education. Nevertheless, Ted Patrick, he chose always to refer to these new religious movements that he was concerned about as being cults. And he also used that term in order to demean and depersonalize those people. Oh, he's just a cult member. You don't have to worry about him. There are tragic stories about the kind of depersonalization and the consequences that had in the lives of some people. Patrick exaggerated and misrepresented the conversion capabilities of these new religious movements. This is a quote from him. Cult members have the ability to come up to you and talk about anything they feel you're interested in, anything. Their technique is to get your attention, then your trust. The minute they get your trust, just like that, they can put you in the cult. Would that it were that easy, right, Dean Boyd? It'd be wonderful it was that easy. But in fact, it's never worked that way. And he also emphasized that cult members, one of the ways that you know that a person has fallen into a cult is that they can no longer think for themselves. So remember that term. You can't think for yourself. Because if we have time, I will have a chance to talk a little bit about Waco later in my presentation. And there's lots of evidence that Waco was really a failed attempt at a mass deprogramming. And the FBI said that they were doing all these things, these rabbit calls, deprivation of food, not allowing them to sleep and everything, because they wanted the members of the Davidian group to think for themselves, a term directly taken from Ted Patrick. And one of the things that Ted Patrick emphasized, what is deprogramming? He said there was a catch to deprogramming, and that is that all it is talk. And he said, but I'm going to talk to you for as long as I have to talk to you. And he said that in some cases that would mean restraint. Yes, it also means that you're not just free to leave or go. And it may even mean a measure of restraint. And those of us who've gone through deprogramming know that that was the case. When I was deprogrammed, I was invited to read chapter 22 of Robert J. Lifton's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. If you read just chapter 22, I'll be very blunt with you, it sounds like a workshop. But when they gave me this book, I said, I'll read chapter 22, but I'll only read it if you let me read the entire book. So they allowed me to read the entire book. And when I read the entire book, I realized that this had nothing to do with anything that happened to us. By the way, when I joined our church, I never attended a workshop. I just went to lectures over about a 6-month period, and eventually I became a member. So the parallel, like confining someone, keeping them there, putting them under duress, that happened to prisoners under the Red Chinese during the Korean War, that particular situation makes a lot more of an analogy to what happens with the deprogramming when you're tied up in a room, when you can't go anywhere, than it has anything to do with a church such as ours. Another of the people that were involved was Dr. John Clark. Dr. John Clark, when I do a search on Google Scholar, I find that he has one publication, and he himself says that he did 2.5 years of research into cults. 2.5 years. Myself and Professor William Lay, we spent 4 years writing our book, Park Statue Politics, which deals with the comfort woman issue, the controversy between Korea and Japan. And that book, which took me to Taiwan, which took both of us to visit a number of sites throughout the United States and learn about the situation of this, which caused us to look at a variety of legal cases and circumstances and interviews, etc. It took us 4 years' time. And honestly, we just have a level of expertise on this phenomenon in the United States, nowhere else. But 2.5 years, and John Clark was a worldwide expert on this. Another is Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman. Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman wrote the book Snapping. Maybe you might have heard of the book Snapping. It's like the textbook if you want to understand how the cults operate. But were they really experts? Neither of them had a terminal degree in any area whatsoever. Neither of them was a religious scholar. Neither of them was a psychologist. And they brought together this incredible explanation that somehow by depriving people of food and sleep, and by exposing them to an information dump of prayer and singing and long lectures, that at some point, through an infinitely complex convergence of physical, mental, and emotional stresses, that there would occur a holographic crisis in the brain that would result in a whole new organization of mind and personality. Let me put that into simple English for you. What is a hologram? It is a three-dimensional image that is formed based on angles set up for the separate beam or laser or coherent light source. So if you change the angle of the lights that create that image, for example, the head that's here, the consequence of that is that by changing the focus of the angle of the beams, then you produce a different face. And so they use this as the base. That's what happens when you go through a conversion experience. Suddenly, at that moment, there is a shift in your hologram light, and as a consequence of that, you develop a new personality. There's a sudden personality syndrome or change that occurs, they allege. This is an unproven hypothesis. It's like believing in the tree god. It's nothing more than a narrative. There's no proof of any of this. And they maintained that through a deprogramming process, a person can go back to the way that they were originally. But is that what really happens to people that are deprogrammed? In most cases, not. Take the case of Stephen Hassan, for example. Now, Dr. Hassan, he did not suddenly go back to whatever he was when he was a student before he met the Unification Church. He instead began to propagate whatever he was taught during his conversion experience. He was converted from being a Unification Church member to being an anti-cult personality. That's what happened in his case, and that's what happened in many other cases. It's not going back to what you were, it's conversion to a new view. That's what actually happens. The problem with Siegelman and Conway is that in just a short time, they wrote a second book. The first book appeared in 1979, I believe. And in 1984, they wrote their second book, Holy Terror, that began to look at all of the fundamentalist Christian groups also as cults and suggesting that they had a violent agenda. And then there was another gentleman by the name of Andre McNichol who talked about the Catholic cults and began to likewise invite people to look at groups like the Knights of Columbus and Marriage Encounter and Opus Dei and others likewise as cults within Catholicism in the same way. Then there was Richard Delgado. Richard Delgado spoke before Senator Dole, and he said religious cults expose their indoctrinees to a greater variety of classic brainwashing techniques and with greater intensity. Two essential elements of informed consent, knowledge and capacity, are not present simultaneously. So whatever happened to Richard Delgado? Well, Richard Delgado was recognized today as one of the key figures in the formulation of critical race theory. And I happened to come across his resume, and it's a 32-page resume, very impressive. But when you get to 31, you see that what he says there is he doesn't say that he testified before the Dole Committee on Cults. It says that he delivered a statement on constitutionality of federal initiatives at request of Congressman Dole and Buckley. So not very direct about what actually happened there. I don't know if he changed his view or not, but certainly he doesn't represent properly in his or fully in his resume what he actually was doing. Robert Betcher was involved in the Fraser report. I don't think I have really time to say too much about him because we're running out of time here. Daphne Green was a parent of one of our church members and had an adverse reaction because one of her children, actually two of her children, I believe, joined our church, and one still is a member. Dr. George Swope had a daughter who joined our church. And then there's Rabbi Morris Davis. Rabbi Morris Davis in 1972 had two of his synagogue members join our church. And he came forward with the guidelines for a cult, which are very much along the same lines as the guidelines that you find with Ted Patrick and others. But most disturbing is that speaking before the U.S. Senator Dole, he made this statement: "We must know and we must never forget that every path leads somewhere. The path of segregation leads to lynching. The path of anti-Semitism leads to Auschwitz. The path of cults leads to Jonestown. We ignore this fact at our peril." In other words, saying that because Jonestown happened, all cults were going to go the way of Jonestown. And then he goes on to say, "The last time I ever witnessed the movement," referring to our movement, "that had these qualifications," I'm going to not go through them all, except maybe four, "with a hatred of everyone on the outside, was the Nazi youth movement. And I tell you, I'm scared." This is really inappropriate, really inappropriate. Why did he have to say such a thing? Very, very unfair, very, very unjust, and historically totally wrong. I'll tell you, I'm scared. The last was Father James LeBar. Father James LeBar basically outlined the same traits of a cult as were outlined by Rabbi Morris Davis. And he passed away in 2008. But in 2019, Archbishop Terence Cook, Cardinal Terence Cook, came before the Archdiocese of New York, and he said that there were 120 priests within the Archdiocese of New York who had been credibly accused of sexual abuse of minors. One of them was Father James LeBar. What is common among all these people? They all had a decided bias against one or more new religions. They all failed to examine the religious underpinnings of the different faiths. They didn't enter into dialogue with any leader or member. They bought into the Patrick and Conway and Siegelman brainwashing myth. They utilized guilt by association. Jonestown, therefore, all cults are going to go into Jonestown. And they twisted facts, making exceptions to rules, unlike they would do for mainstream faiths. What is really meant by expertise in religion? Consider a person like Houston Smith, whom Dr. Walsh knows. I don't know if Dr. Kaufman is on the line, or Dr. Mickler, Dr. Wilson, they know. He spent his first 17 years in China, and his first language was Mandarin. He earned a PhD in religion and philosophy at the University of Chicago. He dedicated 10 years of his life to the study and practice of Vedanta, one of the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy. He dedicated 10 years of his life to the study and practice of Zen Buddhism. He dedicated 10 years of his life to the study and practice of Sufism. For years, he studied, participated in, and actively supported Native American religions and rituals. He met and conferred with Reverend Moon. He delivered lectures at UTS. He participated in religious youth services, the God Conference, the Interreligious Federation for World Peace, for over a period of more than 10 years. And yes, he remained a Christian his entire life. So there are real experts and there are overnight experts. Overnight experts, their course is not over decades. Their course is they don't like a new religion. They learn more about it through an anti-cult movement. They learn to look at that religion based on purely psychological criteria, nothing else, while they continue to have that kind of religious sense of awe for the mainstream churches and religions. they treat all the new religions and their wrongdoings as one religion. If there's a fault in one, they predict the same wrongdoing will happen in others as well. They treat what others would see as the exception. If one person does something wrong in one of the in a particular new religion, they will say that's the rule. So if one ex-member says, I would have killed my parents for so and so, then they say yes. And these people, they will kill their parents. That's how they act. That's how they handle things. And then they have to also develop their own narrative on why they are an expert on the cults. And like the people that I presented, I could show you how each of them developed their narrative if we had more time. And they learn to use demeaning language whenever they refer to new religions. Those are cults. They're not religion. So I'll stop there, Dr.
Yeah.
Ward.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. This is fascinating. And I know you have more to say, and we're happily going to give you time. I just thought I would jump in and maybe just ask a couple of brief follow-up questions before you can resume and complete your full presentation, after which time we'll open it up to the audience for their questions. But what do you think gives rise to this reprogramming phenomenon? Why were members of the Unification Church, yourself and several others, several that I know personally, what do you think lay behind this phenomenon of the kidnapping and effort to deprogram members of our church?
Well, I think the reality is that most people are not educated in religion. Most of us are not a Houston Smith. That's the reality, and therefore, and many people are not really prepared at all to deal with things. And we had a group of people who didn't like, for example, the Unification Church. I'm not going to talk about other faiths, but who didn't like the Unification Church. And someone came along with an explanation about this wasn't really a church. This is just a group that's making a lot of money, and they are in the process of grabbing people, not based upon truth, but upon coercion and forcing them to change their views somehow. They're just love bombing them, as they like to say, and they're guiding them. And these people, they need to be reached. We have to reach them. We have to allow them to think for themselves. As Ted Patrick says, they can't think for themselves. Steve Hassan said that after he joined our church, he lost his ability to speak a lot of the English language. These kind of notions developed. That what their experiences were. As a consequence of coming. So it was a narrative. It was a powerful narrative. It was pushing the exceptions and saying, this is the rule, this is the way these things work. Jonestown did this, therefore Unification Church is going to do this. And it created an hysteria and animosity.
Now, one of the kind of trigger points that I recall back in 1978, I remember being, I believe it was at an ICUS meeting in Boston with Reverend and Mrs. Moon, and somehow close to that time, we heard news of the Jonestown. And this was so shocking. And indeed, the media had a field day of doing exactly what you've been describing. You care to comment on the impact of that Jonestown disaster?
Yes, I can, because I was actually being deprogrammed during the Jonestown disaster. Mm-hmm. And so that was just precisely November of 1978 when this tragic event occurred. I was being deprogrammed. So of course, after that, I felt I need to know everything I can about that organization and that group. So there's a book. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author now, but I did read the book. It talked about the Sky God. And it's the story of Jim Jones, and it's by two of his followers, and it talks about what Jim Jones' worldview was. First of all, most people don't know the fact that Jim Jones did not believe in God, and secondly, that he was fascinated by Lenin, and sometimes to his followers claimed that he was the second coming of Lenin. And also, some of you might be aware that prior to going to Jonestown, or perhaps while he was at Jonestown, really where he really wanted to reside was in the Soviet Union. And when he felt that this oppression was coming down from the U.S. government, we know what happened. He forced people to drink this poisonous drink. A number of people were shot who refused to do so. And he described this process as a revolutionary act, that they were involved in a revolutionary act. So this person, he was not a believer in God. He was a revolutionary. He was strongly impacted by Lenin and by Marx and by the whole Marxist-Leninist perspective. And somehow he was associated with religious leaders. Now, one of the ironies of Jim Jones is that he actually had an association with Rabbi Morris Davis way back when in Indiana, when Rabbi Davis actually sold his church or his synagogue at some point to Jim Jones, I think for $50,000. Mm-hmm. And he made an arrangement whereby there was almost no interest or anything else. He gave him a sweetheart deal, you know. That doesn't mean that, you know, that I'm not suggesting any kind of association, but what I am saying is that Rabbi Davis, who was supposedly so perceptive of all these things, he certainly missed the boat with Jim Jones until after it was too late.
You know, I really appreciated you going through that list of so-called experts to really draw examples of this myth of the cult expert. One that you mentioned briefly is Steve Hassan, who also claims that he was a leader or deep insider of the church back, I guess, in the 70s, and has since claimed to be one of these experts that are heard from time to time, or when you Google anti-cult movement, he will be among those that pop up. Do you have anything to add about his case in particular?
Yes, I do, because I think Steve Hassan was a team leader. He claims he was the assistant director in the headquarters church at 43rd Street. But actually what he was the head of a team of about 18 members who were led by a Japanese leader. He was the assistant of that team, so to speak. And he never went to seminary. He never went to Korea. I don't find him mentioned anywhere in any of Reverend Moon's speeches. I don't think he had any knowledge of the Korean language. He didn't have any of that background. I mean, there are other people who are out there who have a lot of issues with the Unification Church, whom I have to say credibly that they were leaders. Take a person like Michael Warder. I know he has many issues with our church, and I understand that. But whatever you want to say, he was a leader. Michael Warder, was involved in the early days of the seminary. For years, he led the International Conference for the Unity of the Sciences. He met with Reverend Moon on many different occasions. He spoke publicly on many different occasions. Michael Warder is a person, whatever you want to say, who actually had a very genuine experience as a leader. There's nothing like that with Steve Hassan. Steve Hassan was a very young leader. He spent 2 years and 3 months in our church. That's like being a trainee. I mean, he virtually did nothing in comparison. I think Michael Warder is like at least 10 years in our church, you know, very different in cases.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder if people are looking for careers and they kind of, as you say, develop a narrative, but it's also an issue of careerism and finding a niche where they can have a certain degree of celebrity and trade off of that. I don't think it's only in the anti-cult movement, but it's a widespread problem in our society. But Dr. Ward, I want to let you get back to the second half of your presentation, and I'm sure others will also want to weigh in. I've got a lot more questions, but instead of raising more, please take us through the next part of your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. I'll try to do that. So what I'd like to talk about next is what's called media agenda setting and gatekeeping, because this is very much what we're talking about in the case of what has gone on. I mentioned the role that the media has played in the many challenges that the Unification Church has faced. As I said, an interest group needs to reach the media. That includes the anti-cult movement. It needs to reach the media if it's going to have a voice, if it's going to be able to have a deleterious effect upon a movement such as the Unification Church, and even finally point a whole series of organizations and groups, including the IRS, towards our church and towards Reverend Moon. So agenda setting is a term in communication theories. What it means is the ways that media and other institutions prime and frame and shape public opinion. They may be intentional in doing that, they may be unintentional. And we find that as media consumers, by seeing an issue covered in the news and seeing it covered repeatedly and with great emphasis, we come to share with the media, in so many cases, the view that the issue has legitimacy and thus place it on our own agenda. So and this also relates to your question about deprogramming, Dr. Walsh. The point is, there was so much adversity that was expressed about the so-called cults and about the Unification Church in particular, that it became a part of a lot of people's agendas. They were terrorized. There was hysteria. There was animosity that was developed. Secondly, there's something called media gatekeeping. And the core task of all media gatekeepers is to determine which stories to include or exclude from a given day's newspaper or broadcast, and what to emphasize within those stories that are included. It self-frames the issues covered in their publications and programmings. We live in an age when we have very partisan networks. MSNBC has one perspective, Fox News has another perspective. And those two different perspectives, in terms of gatekeeping, some open the gate for some types of stories and others open the gates for other types of stories. But the media plays that gatekeeping role. And one of the stories that much of the media decided to open up was the story about the Unification Church and Reverend Moon. Now, let me give you a very blatant example of gatekeeping. Robert Betcher, who was very much involved in the Koreagate crisis, on the 30th of May, the New York Times reported about his death. They spoke about a fall which had occurred in the apartment building where he lived. That he had fallen off near Central Park. He'd fallen off the building and it had killed him. They talk about a fall, but already 4 days prior to that, the New York Daily News had reported about the death of Robert Betcher. They described it as a suicide. If you can read the article here, they specifically said it was a suicide. They also said that he'd left a 7-page letter to his father. They also mentioned that there had been an eyewitness, someone who had tried to stop him from jumping. This is, for some reason, New York Times wanted to present, maybe they wanted to protect they were concerned about the family. I don't know what the motivation was, but it's very clear that these are two very different stories about what happened to Mr. Betcher. The code of ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists is marvelous. And if it was put into practice, we wouldn't have had some of the problems that we have. Some of the things that are emphasized there is the media must avoid stereotyping of race, gender, age, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical appearance, and social status. Also, to support the open exchange of views, even views they find repugnant. They should also give voice to the voiceless. They should minimize harm. They should show compassion for those who may be affected adversely by news coverage. And they're warned that the pursuit of the news is not a license for arrogance. I think we can easily make the case. I'm not going to judge the last one, but in each of these five, the first five, it's rather clear that that is not what happened in the case of Reverend Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon and the Unification Church. The media violated its own code of ethics, I believe, in the case of new religious movements. Take language, for example. Over and over again, they use the term cult to describe new religions. Gordon Melton, I'm sure you know him, Dr. Walsh, a new religion scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara, said, "My working definition of a cult is a group that you don't like." And I say that somewhat facetiously, but at the same time, in fact, that is my working definition of a cult. It is a group that somebody doesn't like. It is a derogatory term, and I have never seen it redeemed from the derogatory connotations that it picked up in the sociological literature already back in the 1930s. The press typically respects racial, ethnic, and other societal minorities and refers to them respectfully in the way that minority refers to itself. For example, we as unificationists, I think we would like to be called unificationists. But so often the press doesn't respect that. And other minorities, they want to be referred to a certain way. For example, people who are homosexuals, they want to be referred to as gays. The press respects that. Why don't they respect the way in which the unificationists like to be referred to? There's a problem there. It violates its own ethics when it uses a derogatory term such as cult when referring to the Unification Church. Newspapers and Publishers Extra, I did a database search there on terminology between 1970 and 2021. The New York Times is not on there, but there are many others, that the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Examiner, many major newspapers are on that particular database. And I found that between 1970 and 2021, those newspapers used the term cult 3.6 million times approximately. They used the term new religion or new religious movements during that period of 120,000 times. So what that means is that for every one time the media respectively referred to a particular group as a new religion, it used the term cult 30 times. And the anti-cult perspective is often very, very protected and not covered in terms of the news. I don't have time to go into the case of Lisa Steinberg, but Lisa Steinberg was murdered, as many of you know, I think back around 1990, by Joel Steinberg, her stepfather. And Joel Steinberg had very strong ties with the anti-cult movement. He had his wife deprogrammed 9 times. When he was accused of having beaten this poor child to death, his rationale for doing so was that she kept trying to stare and hypnotize me. But none of that appeared. Instead, we found that he had a cocaine abuse problem in the 4 months preceding this. But for 7 years before that, actually, Joel Steinberg was beating up his wife regularly before the cocaine issue came up, but because he believed that she was a cultist and all the members of her family were cultists. Then there's the case of the Falun Gong. There are rumors that the Falun Gong have been involved in organ harvesting. As a matter of fact, the UN Human Rights have expressed alarm concerning the potential organ harvesting. And they show that when suddenly a huge number of organ transplants occurred, and the argument is that somehow this rise in the number of organ transplants, available organs, that when the availability of them came was precisely at the same time when Falun Gong members began to be placed in prison camps. And yet people like Rick Ross and Steve Hassan both refer to the Falun Gong as a cult. As a matter of fact, in his book, Cults Inside Out, which is dedicated to Hao Hui-jun and her daughter Shen Guo, who were members of the Falun Gong and were allegedly involved in a self-immolation, not allegedly, I think they were involved in that, in protest of the government. In fact, instead of giving that possibility as something that happened, and by the way, they were denounced for what they did by the Falun Gong. Rick Ross decided to dedicate his book to that and to refer to them, to the Falun Gong as a cult. And by the way, Rick Ross has spoken at the Center for the Study of the Destructive Cults in China. In other words, really added fuel to the fire to cause for more of these people to be arrested. Until about a year or so back, Mr. Ross actually had a page that showed a whole series of connections to the People's Republic of China and the ties to China's concern to the anti-cult movement. When I did a recent search, that has been removed from his website. However, still on his website, there are a variety of articles that appear showing his commitment to the idea that the Falun Gong were a cult and the fact that he educated people concerning anti-cult movement views in China. Steve Hassan, just a few days ago, May 4th, 2023 now, he refers to the Falun Gong Chinese cult and their connection to the epic time. So likewise for Mr. Hassan, the Falun Gong are a cult. I would remind both Mr. Ross and Mr. Hassan that in China, there's no Google. In China, there's no Facebook, no YouTube, no Wikipedia, no Zoom, no WhatsApp, no Netflix, no Vimeo, no New York Times, no Washington Times, no BBC, no SlideShare, no Washington Post, no ABC, NBC, CBS, Huffington Post, no Voice of America. There's a blackout. And somehow they're very critical of the Falun Gong, but they don't have the same standard concerning all of the control which is going on inside the People's Republic of China. This is unfortunate. Then there's the case of Waco. And Waco is a deeply disturbing and tragic case where if you learn about Waco and what happened there, the reality is that the FBI agents who played the key role in that particular activity, they were, the most important advisor to them was Rick Ross. And there was a variety of types of advice that were given by Rick Ross, basically suggesting that these people were brainwashed. And the FBI opted for what I refer to in an article that I wrote way back in 1991 in the Poughkeepsie Journal, 1993 in the Poughkeepsie Journal, May 7. I referred to what they had done as a mass deprogramming. This included techniques like depriving Koresh and his followers of food, supplies, sleep, noise all night, and the FBI agent in charge wanted Koresh's followers, quote, to think for themselves. Ted Patrick's very words. He wanted them to think for themselves, that's what was going on. And they wanted David Koresh's followers to see their leader as a thief, a liar, a child molester, and a profanity spouting con man. Excuse me. Following Waco, many in Congress began to realize that a wrong had been done. And Dr. Nancy T. Ammerman, a Boston University professor of the sociology of religion, was commissioned to lead an investigation on what had happened and why the federal government had mishandled Waco. In her report to the US government, she said, Mr. Rick Ross was closely involved with both the ATF and the FBI during this process. Ross clearly had the most extensive access to both agencies of any person on the cult expert list. Ross was listened to more attentively. Ammerman learned that Ross recommended that agents attempt to publicly humiliate Koresh, hoping to drive a wedge between him and his followers. Ammerman notes that these embarrassment techniques were indeed tried by the FBI. They followed. And Steve Hassan, who also served as an advisor on Waco, he recommended never to refer to David Koresh as David Koresh, but to use his given name of Vernon. That was his contribution to the process. Philip Arnold was a part of the Reunion Institute. He was one of the religious, a religious scholar who was there and was one of the two, along with James Tabor of the University of North Carolina, who played an important role of somehow interceding with David Koresh during this process. And Philip Arnold and Tabor both believed that actually, and credibly, Koresh was preparing to turn himself in. He had this document, the interpretation of the 7 scrolls, that he was in the process of completing. Philip Arnold and James Tabor were there. They were meeting with him. They were encouraging him. They were guiding him through that particular process. I had the chance to meet with Philip Arnold, and because he read my article that had appeared in the Poughkeepsie Journal, and he said to me that he felt that I was dead on, that's what happened. Instead of trying to have dialogue and understand this person and meet them where they should be met, instead they tried to deprogram that whole movement, and it resulted in the tragic death, as we know, of some 75 people, including more than 20 children. So let's come to our conclusions. Dr. Massimo Introvigne, whom many of you know, and I know Dr. Walsh has worked closely with him, made the observation: when you assess any religion based on purely psychological criteria, you open the way to assessing all religions based on purely psychological criteria. That's why holy terror and Catholic cults and others began to appear, looking at all religions in that way, because the door had opened there. So July 20th, 1984, we know was the day that Reverend Moon went to Danbury. Those individuals, I'm not going to name them here, but those individuals who played such a key role in trying to push that day, they saw Reverend Moon speak before Congress. They saw him meet with senators, but I don't know how many of them anticipated that he would actually go into the prison. He could have gone back to Korea and given up his right to stay in the United States, but he didn't. He determined to stand trial, and he determined likewise to go into prison 39 years ago today. And he served there, as we know, as a model prisoner during that period of time, and became friends with so many other prisoners. There are amazing stories about the things that happened to the prisoners. He said that he was honored to serve to protect religious freedom. That might just sound like words, but I think we can really reflect upon the fact that one of the things I learned through Reverend Moon was to love our country because of the way that he understood the way in which God could love America, because of the attitude of those founding men and women who came to the Plymouth colony. Likewise, the amazing attitude of those slaves who had been so mistreated being brought to the United States, but yet they became men and women of incredible faith. They could, in spite of all the horrors of what they were subjected to, they could respect the fact that there was something in Christianity, something in Christ that they could that commiserated with them and with their circumstance. Likewise, Reverend Moon could see that noble dimension of Dr. Martin Luther King and the example that was established by him. This beautiful religious tradition, which was still very much in place when he first arrived in 1970, although in the midst of being challenged. Already in 1962, Engel versus Vitale had come into place, and prayer had been banned in schools. People like myself and Dr. Walsh, I'm sure and Dean Boyd, we prayed in school during our early years. The 10 Commandments, which were in so many schools and in so many city squares, that began to be pulled down once prayer had been removed. Orientations in public schools and in other schools about the dangers of the so-called cults that happened in schools across the United States. Reverend Moon foresaw that these types of things were happening. Somehow, that's when I didn't think of what he meant by religious freedom until we've seen what's happened since then. The 10 Commandments, talking about, thou shalt not commit adultery, the fostering of purity that was so common, and suddenly condoms being distributed in schools across our country. No longer the need to honor your father and mother. You just get the condoms no matter what. And also guides for ways to be able for children to get for a young person to get an abortion without involving their parent in any way, shape, or form. And finally, even the circumstance where we have schools encouraging young people to go through a transgender process, and for boys to use the women's room, men to use women to use the men's room if they so desire. An incredible confusion, an incredible loss of that foundation that Reverend Moon valued and appreciated so much. Reverend Moon came to this country and he cried out to the people in this country and reminded them about the spirit of his founders. It took a Korean man to come here in the 1970s to call out for those things. It was him who also inspired so many young people like Dr. Walsh, Dean Boyd, myself, and so many others, I'm sure, who are on this line, on this program tonight, to transform themselves because of him and become upright. A strong encouragement of the value of the family as the school of love, the place where we learn to really love and appreciate each other, a place where we learn to love our children and to see others as our children as well. The place where Black and white can come together, Asian and white can come together, and true reconciliation can come together in that kind of a format. Reverend Moon came in order to be able to share that kind of a foundation in our country. He wanted to bring that into this nation, and he was willing to go to prison in order to protect that tradition that he came to be able to share. So next year, we will reach 40 years. Actually, Korean number already, this is the 40th commemoration, but next year we reach 40 years. It will be 40 years since Reverend Moon went to prison at that time. We can't forget, we can forgive, but we can't forget the things that led him to go through all the ordeals that he went through and the ordeals that so many of us had to go through. But ultimately, Reverend Moon can and will be recognized for what he is. It will be vindicated. And Dr. Hak Jahan Moon really sees that as something that really has to happen. America has to awaken, understand her identity, understand her mistakes. She said that July 20th, 1984 was a day that never should have occurred. So anyway, that's why it did occur. That's why we have to commemorate it and hopefully help this nation to correct what it did that was wrong.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Ward, for a very powerful, meaningful presentation. So I'm sure all of our members of the audience are very, very grateful. It's hard to believe that in this era of diversity, equity, and inclusion and postmodern awareness of the way power groups operate in the world, that seems to be this exception for newer religious movements and an effort to kind of shut the door on the advance of a providence that religion always arose and emerged from a tiny seed in a few people and often went through courses of being despised and over time earned the respect. But it's just tragic that even today this kind of prejudicial bigotry and ignorance, as you pointed out, continues.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh, and I appreciate this opportunity to be able to share. Thank you, Dean Boyd, as well. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight as we commemorate this sad but sacred event, if we think of our father's determination on this night when he headed for Danbury about this time.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Dean Boyd.
Well, I just want to thank everyone, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Ward, for coming this evening. Dr. Ward, excellent presentation again. Dr. Walsh, as always, a wonderful host and really expert in guiding the conversation to the key points. Again, we had many questions. I think there were almost 30 questions in the Q&A box, but unfortunately couldn't cover them all. You're welcome. If your question was not answered, I put my email address, my contact information in the chat box. You're welcome to direct your question to me and I can pass it along to Dr. Ward and Dr. Walsh. quite happily for them to respond to you. But I guess, Dr. Walsh, I'd just like to say in closing that I think tonight's event is representative of the spirit and the mission of HJI to represent our co-founders, our true parents, Dr. Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, and in that spirit be a home of thought, as our mission statement and strategic plan outline for our entire movement and beyond unificationist walls. So I just like to thank everyone for coming, but also to recall in your minds that HJI exists for our unification community primarily. We have many non-unificationists here as students and on our faculty, but we would like to invite you to look more deeply into our programs of study. We're confident that what we have to offer here can be of use and value to people of all ages, all generations. And again, that is offered in the spirit, as Dr. Walsh alluded to create the leaders for tomorrow, the leaders for today and for tomorrow. So we invite you. I have put some links in the chat box. You're welcome to click on those. I'm happy to receive any kind of query on your side about what HJI is doing in terms of academic programs and otherwise. Please contact me. And so once again, everyone, thank you for joining us. Again, we had several hundred registered. We had over, I think, close to 200 people on the call tonight from all over the country and around the world. It's really our blessing and privilege, our honor to serve you in this way. So thank you for coming. God bless you all, wherever you are. Good night, good morning, good evening. And sayonara. See you soon. Stay tuned next week. Next month, we'll be having our next program. You'll be hearing from us in your inbox. Look for those emails. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bless everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Thank you, Dean Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful program.
Angelica, thank you. Thank you.
God bless.
Angelica Brzezinski. Great work.
Great.